So you will be online in 3, 2, 1. You are online.
Thank you. First off, I just want to thank the organizers for bringing us together in this virtual platform for this conference, which is always a delight. I'm Lisa Macklem. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Western Ontario. I'm also a lecturer at King's University College. And my topic is rebalancing copyright in an unbalanced world. This is a really big picture kind of project, and it's very North American centric, and the reason for that is because of how much influence particularly the US has on the copyright sphere. So I'm looking at this attempt then, or an attempt that we need to sort of rebalance voices, because copyright is a balancing act. We're always, balancing those economic incentives versus promoting innovation and creation. So we need to then sort of rebalance these voices, bringing the creator's voice to the forefront rather than the corporate owner voices, bringing the developing world voices to the forefront rather than the developed countries' voices, and balancing, owner versus user. And that really should also be creator as well, because of course the creator is not always the owner of their own output. So fair use factors are also a balancing act, of course, and they start with purpose, but they often don't give it enough weight. And I've just shared here, the American fair use and the Canadian fair dealing. I am based in Canada, so that's kind of also where my focus lies. And of course, the number one factor for fair use is the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. And of course, the number one factor in the fair dealing test is the purpose of the dealing. So I think these really need to be dug down to and really looked at. Why is it that people are borrowing and using copyright? What is the nature of their use and so forth? So of course, research and education should be at the heart of innovation and creation, and that purpose is often overlooked. So it's important then that we really support research and education, and the pandemic really caused us to rebalance our lives as well. So artists had no access except through the internet to connect with their audiences. Owners had been working to make access more challenging at that point, and education and social interaction all also moved online. And these things caused a bit of a shift and a change, which I think is good going forward. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as I said, challenged virtually every aspect of people's lives. Access to educational materials, news, and government regulations all moved almost completely online in the blink of an eye. At the same time, some of the most draconian policies controlling that information started to be put in place. Those with purely economic interests had long been lobbying for greater restrictions on the flow of information. A common misunderstanding is that open access materials are by default at odds with these economic interests. There needs to be a more creative and holistic understanding of both the process of creativity and innovation and the motives behind things like open access materials. In the recent York University versus Canadian Copyright Licensing Agency case, Justice Abella took a nuanced consideration of the purpose of York's dealing, and I quote from the case: "Funds saved by proper exercise of the fair dealing right go to the university's core objective of education, not to some ulterior commercial purpose," end quote. In the Google v. Oracle in the US, the Supreme Court clearly understood the basics of the open software history. Justice Breyer references the National Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works that concluded that, quote, "Copyright's existing doctrines, for example, fair use, applied by courts on a case-by-case basis, could prevent holders from using copyright to stifle innovation." End quote. Justice Breyer links public interest goals to the nuances afforded through a careful attention to context. Fair use, and I quote again, "can carry out its basic purpose of providing a context-based check that can help to keep a copyright monopoly within its lawful bounds," end quote. In declaring so much of the code as fair use in that case, they underscored the amount of education needed to create code, and they honored it. By allowing coders to skip reinventing the wheel, they allowed them to concentrate on new modes of transportation. It is this public interest to nurture and support creators and innovators by providing access to educational and cultural works. So in understanding where we're going, I want to step back and take a look at where we've come from. So again, while I'm looking specifically at a North American perspective, that doesn't mean that this is the only valid history that needs to be understood. My interest lies primarily in understanding the most dominant voices in controlling access to culture through copyright, the United States. North America and many other British colonies begin their history of copyright with the stationer's monopoly of 1557. The intention of this legislation was to give the publishers complete control over the works they copied in an attempt to prevent seditious writings. It was a means of censorship. The same kind of censorship that David Adams Richards was concerned about with Bill C-10, and I will talk about that later in the talk. Moving on from 1557 to 1710 and the Statute of Anne, this is the first recognized Copyright Act, and the complete title of the Statute of Anne is, I quote, "An act for the encouragement of learning by vesting the copies of printed books in the authors or purchasers of copies during the times therein mentioned." Finally, here we have an emphasis on the author creator, but it's also on the user and education and learning. It was also to be a limited vestment of control. First copyright statute granted protection of 21 years for books already in print, and new works would receive 14 years of protection and an additional 14 years if the author was still alive. The intention was clearly to benefit the author during their lifetime. The statute also sought to at least blunt, quote, "the pernicious effects of monopolies since the 17th century." So society had moved from the Renaissance belief in divine inspiration that God simply spoke through authors to the humanist belief in the power of the author and creators themselves. However, there was another valuable lesson that came out of the Renaissance as well. Education from the earliest grades largely followed the classic traditions of rhetoric, which placed a strong emphasis on imitation of the classics in order to master the material. This system of education was prevalent through to the early 20th century, and forms of it are still taught today. So coming from a very different tradition, education in China is also firmly grounded in imitation and repetition, to the extent that many Chinese international students at Western universities struggle with what is to them a very foreign concept of plagiarism. The Statute of Anne also recognized the need for education, for creators and authors to learn their craft. In addition, still grounded in the traditions of classical rhetoric, is a belief that a strong democracy requires an educated populace. Indeed, this belief in the importance of an educated populace to support democracy was a driving force behind the Federal Communication Commission in the United States, mandating that basic television should be available for free for all citizens. The FCC's mandate, according to US Code 47, is, quote, "to make available, so far as possible, to all the people of the United States, without discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex, a rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges." The Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission in Canada has similar mandates to provide access to news, particularly in both official languages, to all citizens. The Statute of Anne was also concerned with ensuring access to works. Section 5 of the statute states that a number of copies of each book or books on the best paper are to be delivered to 9 specific libraries. The practice of submitting a copy of a work to the Library of Congress, as per copyright registration in the United States, has a very similar purpose. On the Library of Congress website, it states that, quote, "the library preserves and provides access to a rich, diverse, and enduring source of knowledge to inform, inspire, and engage you in your intellectual and creative endeavors." Copyright's traditional tension between providing incentive for creators through monetary reward and providing access to works to further innovation and creativity has a long history. Yet there's been a disconnect between the business of creation and innovation and what the creative process really entails. Nothing is created in a vacuum, and few geniuses spring fully formed from their mothers. Mark Greenberg points out that the, quote, "history of human society is, in many regards, a history of creativity. It was through the creative process that civilizing inventions like the use of fire for cooking, diversion of water for irrigation and bathing, and related items were discovered and became key elements in improving our lives. Those same creative processes yielded the arts of storytelling, painting, and the beginnings of what became human cultures. So having access to culture and education through which to learn a craft are crucial and valuable parts of the process. And I'm just going to start skipping ahead because I'm running out of time. So owning and monetizing content relies both on volume and scarcity. So COVID-19 resulted in more people spending more time online than ever before. In addition to impromptu concerts on balconies, people also turn to alternative means to entertain themselves. A recent study revealed that TikTok has an estimated 80 million monthly active users compared to Spotify's 356 million active users worldwide. 75% of those TikTok users, an estimated 600 million, say that they discover new artists through TikTok, according to a new MRC data study released by the short video platform. 63% of all TikTok users say they heard new music that they'd never heard before on the platform. One of the important differences between Spotify and TikTok is that TikTok directly inspires creation through dance challenge videos, which are generally judged by how well they mimic the original. However, perhaps the most salient example of TikTok's power is Nathan Apadoca's video in October 2020 of him riding his skateboard to work, drinking Ocean Spray cranberry juice, and dubbing Fleetwood Mac's song Dreaming. The short video resulted in a number of copycats, including celebrities and even Mick Fleetwood, shown here. But perhaps most importantly, it resulted in the 43-year-old Fleetwood Mac song rocketing to number 21 on the Billboard Hot Top 100. The song also had its best download and streaming sales in its history, so it directly benefited the original work. Musicians have been relying on live concerts to make a living, but with COVID-19, this all came to a stop. Bruce Houghton explains that creators have turned elsewhere for revenue streams. According to Signal Free, creators on platforms like YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, etc., they're primarily earning their money by advertising revenues, sponsored contact, product placement, tipping, paid subscriptions, digital content sales, merchandise shoutouts, live and virtual events, VIP meetups, and fan clubs. Musicians have turned to the internet away from big studio deals to take more control of their careers and their content. They are also displaying a new attitude to sharing their content, as everyone wants their song to feature on the next TikTok challenge. Typically, when thinking of mainstream cultural distributors, we're thinking about the United States. They're maximizing their profits allows these media companies to do three main things that affect author creators' ability to make a living and users' ability to access culture. Firstly, it allows them to buy content relatively inexpensive, as authors, creators, particularly those starting out, are in the weaker negotiating position. Media conglomerates can afford to go to court. It's expensive. They do it all the time. They know the system and they know how to win. The third effect is the deep pockets of media conglomerates is their ability to influence the law itself through lobbying. As if the huge media conglomerates weren't enough in and of themselves, in the lobby sphere, it is the industry bodies such as the MPAA and the Recording Industry of America that combine these media conglomerates into an even more effective wedge. Benjamin Mitra Khan, in responding to the Hargreaves report, which focused on lobbynomics, used evidence for policymaking to defend the government economists who are instructed to provide the best advice you can, given what you know at this point. That doesn't mean providing the right advice after 12 months of research. Lobbyists often go in without knowing enough about the industries that they're lobbying about. And I'm just going to keep jumping ahead here. So the challenge for any country then is to nurture artists, authors, and creators. And this is not a single, simple, a single-pronged solution. Some of this can no doubt be done through funding. However, the Copyright Act can help as well. During the copyright review that was conducted in 2018, musician Bryan Adams, shown here, appeared before the Heritage Committee to ask for music creators and artists to have more control over their work through changes to the Copyright Act. Currently, artists who license ownership to someone else have those rights revert back to their heirs 25 years after their death. Adams proposed that the reversion should happen 25 years after the rights were first assigned, which would mean the artist would likely benefit in their lifetime, like the Statute of Anne thought was a good idea. They could either monetize the work themselves if the current owner wasn't exploiting it, or enter into a new license or renew the current license if they were satisfied with it. The important point is that it would be the artist, creator, author making the decision. Having well-established artists use their voice to speak for those who don't have the same recognition, who can't afford to simply fly to Ottawa to speak directly to Parliament, even if Parliament would entertain them, is another way to increase the volume on creators' voices. Recently, the Canadian government introduced Bill C-10, which would have seen sweeping changes to the regulation of content on the internet, another way of silencing voices. Without going into all the details of the bill here, the happy ending is that this bill died with the recent federal election. However, it came very close to being rubber stamped through. What stopped it from allowing rigorous government oversight of free speech? A famous Canadian author and senator, David Adams Richard. He relied on his own personal experiences in his speech against the bill. When I was younger, I'm quoting, my book, Hockey Dreams, was ready to be filmed by the CBC. At the last minute, the CBC creative director decided not to film it. The CBC is the national broadcaster. At the last moment, CBC creative director decided not to film it. He said, I just realized Canada already has a hockey movie. I told him that the US didn't even like hockey and they had 8. He was a man from England. 2 producers, one in New York and one in Los Angeles, told me to change the setting to New England and they would be sure to get it made. That is like the Mighty Ducks movies of the 1980s. Make it about American kids, not Canadian ones. But that would have been a betrayal of my country, which it seems had no qualms about betraying me. The idea that I was ever included in the grand pan-Canadianism that afforded an outlet to Canadian writers was nonsense. That my work was embraced because it was of a certain ethnicity or background was and is entirely bogus. For years, I felt the Canadian literary world and the world promoted by the CBC had little or nothing to do with me or where I lived, end quote. Richards goes on to make more general statements about the importance of freedom of expression and the importance of having even difficult conversations. It's clear that there needs to be more opportunity for more voices and there needs to be more freedom of choice. Richards' final statement is a powerful one. I will always and forever stand against any bill that subjects freedom of expression to the doldrums of governmental oversight, and I implore others to do the same. I don't think this bill needs amendments. I think, however, it needs a stake through the heart, end quote. Michael Geist concluded that, quote, after months of Canadian Heritage Minister Stephen Gobert invoking the names of cultural lobby groups as evidence of support for Bill C-10, it took one of Canada's most celebrated authors to set the record straight and bring the debate to a close, end quote. So traditionally in Canada, the CBC has perhaps not been as inclusive of the multicultural aspects of the country, have not necessarily done a good job of showing us back what is Canadian. This question of what is Canadian is very elusive. So, you know, most broadcasters are asked to pay into the broadcasting fund, and this is the media fund, that Canadian Media Fund, that is then distributed to those that the Canadian Media Fund deems to be worthy. When Netflix came in, they, as a streamer, there was no real mechanism for them to contribute to that, and they did not wish to. However, they did commit $5 million over 3 years within, over 5 years within the Canadian film industry. They managed to do that within 3 years. They also managed to bring a quintessentially sort of Canadian show, Schitt's Creek, to international recognition. And again, that was something else that blew up out of COVID, is everybody started binging Schitt's Creek. It won every Emmy possibly available, et cetera. The latest, I think that's a better use of their money. They are supporting the film industry. They're giving jobs to Canadians. And in fact, they are educating those people to be able to become the best in their field anywhere in the world. And they are able to promote and bring forward Canadian culture in that way. So I think we need to be looking at new models. We need to be letting creators really take hold and determine what they want to do with their own works and how they want to distribute it and how they want to profit off it or not. I think there needs to be more flexibility. So in order to create a true balance, copyright needs to lean into its initial purpose, nurture creation through education. In order to achieve this effectively, it's important to listen to the voices who are not being heard. What do creators want and need? Clearly, the answer will be different in different parts of the world and in different streams of endeavor. Copyright needs to be flexible enough to encompass these disparate voices. And I think we still need that international baseline as well to help create that ultimate balance. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. We are offline now.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I talked so fast. I didn't
Yeah,
even half of my